Charlemagne, crowned by God, April 799, Rome.
Well, I guess that works. Okay. Pope Leo III dashed through the streets of Rome. 3 boys on a corner stared in disbelief as the leader of the Christian church fled past them, clutching at the pointed mitre on his head. An angry mob was close on his heels. "Get him! Don't let him get away!" they yelled. Only a minute earlier, Leo had been leading a procession of worshippers through the city toward the Flaminian Gate. It was the annual feast day remembering the life of Saint Mark. Praying aloud and chanting the Psalms, the peaceful worshippers were suddenly interrupted by shouts. "Leo is a fraud! Paschal should be pope!" Several men brandishing knives emerged from the crowd. The worshippers scattered. "What pagans are these who disturb the worship of their brothers?" Leo scolded in a commanding tone. "You are a fraud!" the men screamed again and came at him with their knives. Astonished, Leo turned and fled. He dashed toward the gate, but his elegant white robes were not suited for sprinting. They twisted around his ankles and he stumbled. Yanking at the knotted hem, he hoisted the robes over his knees and got back on his feet. It was too late. The mob tackled him, punching and kicking. "Cut out his tongue!" yelled a man. "He'll never teach us again." "Cut out his eyes!" cried another. "A blind man can't lead others." Leo curled into a ball and protected his face with his hands as they slashed at him with their knives. Scarlet stains began to spread around his beautiful robes. Strong hands seizing him, lifting him off the ground. With the movement came an intense wave of pain, and he faded out of consciousness. When he awoke, he was lying on a bed in a dim, quiet room. His head was wrapped with bandages. Where am I?" he mumbled. Pain shot through his jaw, and he winced. A woman's face appeared before him. "He's awake. Get the deacon." She smiled at him. "You're at St. Peter's, safe for now. Deacon John is on his way." Almost immediately, John was at his side. "It's good to see you awake, Leo. You've been out cold for hours. What happened?" "Paschal's men tried to kill you." "That part I remember," said Leo, trying not to move his jaw. "But why?" "They say Paschal should be pope instead of you. They claim it's his right, since his uncle Adrian was the last one to hold the honorable office." "I was voted in legitimately by the bishops," insisted Leo, trying to sit up. He was too weak and fell back on his bed, gasping. "Take it easy, Father," John said. "Paschal and his brother Campulus have convinced several of the judges that you have taken the office illegally. The mob tried to cut out your tongue so you would be declared incompetent." "Well, at least part of my tongue is still there, because it's so swollen I can hardly swallow." "We got to you just in time. Actually, it was this man," said John, standing to greet the young man who entered. "Leo, you remember Abbot Angilbert, the ambassador from King Charles's court? He was in the procession with his guards. They are the ones who pulled Paschal's men off you." "I am grateful," said Leo. The young man smiled. "I don't think they'll attack again in public. It won't help their cause for the bishops to catch them harming the Pope. But my guards have surrounded your room in case they try to sneak in and finish the job." "We have to convince the bishops that they have been misled," said Leo. "It will take the persuasion of someone powerful. We must contact the emperor." "Of course," said John, exchanging glances with Angilbert. "But Leo, it has been many years since an emperor has shown concern for Rome. and the current emperor is just a boy. His mother might speak on my behalf. Empress Irene has her problems, her own problems. Under Roman law, she cannot rule illegitimately. There is much unrest already. We cannot rely on Constantinople to help you. Then there is no one to argue my case. Engelbert stepped forward. No one except King Charles. Why would the king of the Franks intervene in a Roman dispute? I know he was friendly with Pope Adrian, and of course he sent those lovely gifts with you when I was elected, but certainly his priorities are with his own people, far to the north. Why do you think I am still in Rome, Leo? Replied Engelbert. If the king did not have an interest in the affairs of Rome, I would not have been in the procession that day to rescue you. Are you saying you're a spy? Leo demanded, trying again to sit up. It's not spying if your intentions are obvious. What does an ambassador do after all? Charles sent me here to keep an eye on his interests, and those interests include the Church of Christ and her earthly leader. What difference does it make to him who is Pope? You can ask him that yourself, said Engelbert, handing over a letter bearing the elegant Frankish seal. Pope Leo III, you are summoned to Paderborn to appear before Charles the Great, King of the Franks and the Lombards. Leo sputtered, struggling to throw off the bedclothes. No foreign king, no matter how friendly, rules over God's church and her pope. Charles doesn't have the authority to summon me. But he does have the resources to help you, John insisted. Empress Irene is not going to bother with Rome. Charles is your only ally. Leo stared at his deacon. You have already made the arrangements, haven't you? We leave tonight, John replied earnestly. The governor has offered his personal carriage and driver, so we'll have no interference from Paschal. You forget that I can barely move, said Leo, sinking back on the bed. I will carry you to the carriage myself. Engelbert and I will both accompany you. Engelbert rose to leave. We go first to the Duke of Spoleto's. He has offered you protection while you recover. When you're well enough to travel, we will cross the Alps and make the longest part of the journey. He nodded respectfully and ducked out the door. John leaned in close to his friend. Leo, you must swallow your pride and obey the summons. You need Charles's support. They left that night, as planned, and reached Spoleto without incident. Leo regained much of his strength in the Duke's hospitality. Within a few weeks, a small caravan headed north, flanked by a contingent of Spoleto's cavalry. Passage through the Alps was difficult enough because of the terrain, but more dangerous were the bands of wandering raiders. John prayed that the journey would be swift and quiet. Tell me more of this Charles the Great, called Charlemagne, said Leo, as the carriage jolted along the rough mountain trail. Is it true that he forces his enemies to accept Christianity? I was a child in Charles's court when he defeated the Saxon rebel Widukind, replied Engelbert. Charles gave him a choice, baptism or execution. And Widukind converted? Engelbert shrugged. He accepted Christian baptism, so Charles spared the lives of all his warriors and made them part of his army. He looked away thoughtfully. They were conquered by water rather than the sword. Leo shifted as they hit another rut in the road, adjusting the cushion at his back. Charles is a compassionate conqueror, then? Not always. The Saxons have been raiding our eastern borders for a long time. A few years before Widukind was defeated, Charles lost a number of men in a battle, and in revenge he ordered the slaughter of 4,500 Saxon prisoners of war. Leo put a hand over his eyes and rubbed his temples. This is the man to whom the church turns for help? His companions didn't answer. They finally reached Paderborn. Abbot Engelbert led them into the marble halls of the palace, where an armed escort was waiting for them. "You are expected in the king's chapel, sir," the guard said. John left to see that their baggage was unloaded. "You will excuse me as well," Engelbert said. "There are many people I wish to see." At the door of the chapel, Leo was met by a man in a red tunic with gold embroidery at the hems. He knelt when he saw the Pope, and Leo noticed that his curly hair was cropped short and covered with a small white cap. "Roman Father, welcome." Leo placed a hand on the man's head. "Stand up, my son." "The king is expecting you," said the man, rising. "He had urgent business and asked that I show you his chapel while you wait. My name is Alcuin." "I've heard of you. You are the Saxon deacon who runs Charlemagne's palace school, aren't you? I understand he has a deep commitment to the arts and education." "I did run the school, yes, but the king recently made me the director of his scriptorium in Aachen. I am responsible for teaching the Bible to young monks and making sure books, especially the Bible, are copied accurately." "Excellent," said Leo, nodding. "But why are you not at work in your monastery?" "I beg your pardon, Father, but news of Paschal's accusations against you arrived many days ago. They say that you rule Rome with tyranny and that you have committed unimaginable sins." "Lies," asserted Leo. "I am the king's theological adviser, so he called me here to meet with you." "Does he doubt me? Please, Father, walk with me as we talk." Leo followed him through the chapel, gazing up the high, painted arches overhead. In the afternoon sun, the colored glass windows along the western wall glowed like giant rubies and sapphires. Alcuin stopped in front of one, portraying David and Goliath. In the shadow of the giant, the boy clutched a slingshot with 5 small stones. Leo wondered briefly if the stones in the window were real diamonds. "I am sure you know that Charlemagne was raised in a God-fearing home," said Alcuin. "His grandfather, Duke Charles Martel, promoted the work of Boniface the missionary, and sent his sons to school at the monastery of St. Denis. Charlemagne was a 9-year-old prince when Pope Stephen III came to visit the court of his father, King Pepin. Stephen pronounced a blessing on the royal family, and Pepin vowed to protect the church. Now that Charlemagne rules in his father's place, he believes it is his duty to keep his father's vow. I am aware that when Charlemagne conquered the Lombards a few years ago, he returned to Pope Adrian much of the land that the Lombards had taken," acknowledged Leo. "Yes," Alcuin nodded. "Charlemagne supports Rome and will continue to honor the leader of the church. But the charges brought against you are serious. If you are to successfully regain your position in Rome, the accusations must be examined carefully. Otherwise, Paschal would continue to claim that your position is not legitimate. His claims could lead to instability both in Rome and the Frankish territories. So Charlemagne's interest in this situation is purely political." Alcuin smiled. "The king is a very complicated man. He sees many aspects of an issue. And you alone are to examine me and determine my guilt or innocence?" "Oh, no," said Alcuin, stopping abruptly. "I simply advise the king." Leo looked intently into the deacon's blue eyes. And why should I trust you? I am from Saxony, not Rome, so I have no hidden loyalties. And I am protected by Charlemagne, so I have no reason to fear Paschal, or you, for that matter. Very well, Leo sighed. I put my life in your hands. Alcuin led Leo out of the chapel, and with a nod to the guards at their posts, into the royal court. The beams set in the arches were hung with tapestries. Torches flickered along rows of pillars. Leo's attention was drawn to a massive marble throne in the center of the hall. It was unoccupied. This room is normally busy as a beehive, said Alcuin, but Charlemagne wished to speak with you privately. Behind them, heavy footsteps echoed on the floor tiles. Welcome, holy Leo, bellowed a deep voice. Leo turned as a splendid figure dropped to one knee in reverence before him. A luxurious blue cloak fell in graceful folds from broad shoulders. The brown, wavy hair was long and streaked with gray. Leo placed a hand in blessing on the king's head. Rise, great Charles, my son. It is an honor to protect you, replied Charlemagne, rising swiftly and towering over Leo. He flung back his cloak, and the Pope noticed a fine sword at his side, the hilt glittering with jewels. I was just admiring your throne, said Leo. I knew you would like it, boomed the king. I had it made to the specifications of King Solomon's throne. A little bit of the Bible in my own palace. Your service to the church is unmatched, said Leo, and yet I must ask you to aid her once again. Charlemagne gazed at him with piercing eyes under thick brows. They say you are a tyrant in Rome. The heavy mustache and beard made it impossible to tell if he was smiling or frowning. I lead the church as have the popes before me, replied Leo. When I received the papal office from Adrian, his relatives were furious. They believe it belongs to their nephew, and they will do anything to have it. You can still see the scars they gave me attacking me in the streets. What has the Emperor of Constantinople to say about this? While we were at Spoleto, we sent a courier ahead to Constantinople for help, but the emperors have long abandoned the Church of the West. Irene and her son are no different. They refuse to help? Asked Alcuin. The message I received was, the Pope has his own kingdom to deal with, one higher than mine. Let him take his own revenge. The king gestured as if to say that Constantinople was of no significance. This Paschal has a following, Leo. His charges are serious. His charges are false. At the advice of Alcuin and others, I have decided to call a hearing. Alcuin has explained to me your wishes, said Leo. I consent, but I cannot return to Rome without being killed. Then I will send a small army with you, declared Charlemagne, settling into his throne, and lawyers to defend you. We will call a synod of your bishops when I arrive. You will not come with me? I have other business first. Aachen is threatened by Muslim armies, and minor factions of the Saxons continue to threaten my borders here. Suppressing Widukind didn't end all of the fighting. Is it true that you forced him to be baptized? You doubt my missionary methods? The king laughed. I have no doubt that Widukind was happy to accept Christianity and escape execution. Like the other rebel leaders I have defeated. It is a fast way of making converts, my friend. You should leave the converting to me. And you should leave the fate of my enemies to me. It is my job to defend the church. It is your job to pray for my success." He clapped his hands, and guard appeared on either side of his throne. "Give the Pope and his companions whatever they need to prepare for their return to Rome. Tonight we shall set aside our troubles and feast together." "You are gracious," said Leo with a nod. "The Church will not forget your labors on her behalf." Leo and John returned to Rome with an army of Frankish soldiers. But there was no clash when they arrived. Word of Charles's support for Leo spread quickly through the city. November arrived in Rome, and with it Charlemagne. "Where are your accusers?" he asked Leo. "They refuse to present evidence, but the bishops have been called to a synod anyway. They will gather here in a matter of days. Come, I will show you the cathedral." Even the Frankish king with his splendid palaces was impressed with the architecture of St. Peter's. He immediately asked to be taken to the sanctuary. Leo left him kneeling before the altar in prayer. Rome buzzed with the word of Charlemagne's arrival. By nightfall, the city overflowed with attendants, lawyers, theologians, and knights. John and Engelbert stood on the city walls, watching the flickering fires of the army camped outside the gates. Leo prayed long into the night, hoping his tribulations would soon be over, and tucked into his borrowed bed at St. Peter's. The great king of the Franks snored loudly. The bishops soon arrived from every region of Italy. On the appointed day, the cathedral was lined with rows of brightly dressed clerics. They flapped like a startled flock of birds as Charlemagne entered, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the legendary king. Without a glance in their direction, he took his place of honor at the front and nodded to the presiding bishop to begin. Leo, with John behind him, sat in the chancel next to the bishop. He was dressed in full papal regalia, in snowy white robes and gold-edged mitre. Glancing at the empty seats, the bishop rose hesitantly and cleared his throat. "We are here to review the charges that have been brought against the Holy Father Leo. We are, still awaiting for the accusers to arrive." A whisper ran through the bishops. "Where is Paschal?" "I am told Paschal and Compilus will be here shortly," the bishop continued. "We will give them a little more time." Charlemagne leaned over and spoke to an official seated next to him. The man nodded and quietly left the room. Moments passed. All eyes were focused on the king, who shifted impatiently in his seat and waved another assistant to his side. "The synod wishes to recognize Charles the Great for his gracious dedication to the Church of Rome," said the bishop. "Without his assistance—" "Enough!" cried Charlemagne, rising from his chair. "The frightened sparrows hide themselves. Where are these men who have wasted our time? Did I bring an army to fight the wind?" "Mighty king," appealed the bishop, "if we wait just a few more—" "Nonsense!" Charlemagne turned his penetrating stare on the crowd of bishops. "Is there anyone here who dares challenge the reputation of Pope Leo?" His deep voice echoed in the chamber. "Was this man beaten in vain?" the king demanded, striding down the aisle. "Was his tongue slashed and his body stabbed for entertainment?" The bishops eyed one another, but said nothing. "Will anyone bring charges against this man, or shall we end this nonsense once and for all?" The bishops began to murmur. Feet apart, arms folded across his polished breastplate, Charlemagne hovered over the synod. The presiding bishop resumed his place at the altar. "There is none here worthy to judge the Pope," he said. Leo stood then and walked to the front row of bishops. "If there are no challenges," he stated, Then I wish to swear an oath today that I am innocent." The presiding bishop glanced at Charlemagne, who had not resumed his seat, and nodded. Leo raised a copy of the Gospels over his head. "That I may partake of God's promises on the day of the great judgment," he shouted, "I am innocent of the charge that is falsely laid against me." Holy Leo has sworn on the gospel of Christ that he is innocent. What is the finding of this court?" demanded the king. The bishop looked out over his colleagues. No one moved. He cleared his throat again. "As no evidence has been brought against Leo, this synod finds him innocent," he declared. "Leo is, and shall continue to be, the rightful leader of the church until the Almighty God delivers him unto the eternal rest." The king flashed a broad smile at the pope and swept out of the sanctuary. A train of guards and advisers exited in a rush behind him. Leo found him later dictating letters to one of his attendants. "The church thanks you for your assistance," said the pope. "My father took his promise to your predecessors seriously, and so do I. Christmas is only 2 days away now. Surely you will celebrate the feast of the Nativity with us in Rome before returning across the Alps." "Of course! You are planning the usual services at midnight, dawn, and midday?" "Yes. Rome's traditions will be observed, but with your presence," Leo said with a mysterious smile. "It will be a more glorious celebration than ever before." No one, except the powerful king of the Franks, could have guessed what Leo had in mind. On Christmas Day, Rome was alive with festivities. It was a civil holiday, and merchants deserted their market stalls, laborers set aside their tools, and government officials left their debates. Starting at midnight, thousands of people attended church services with their families and prepared the biggest feasts they could afford. At the midday service, St. Peter's was packed with Roman citizens, visiting bishops, and members of Charlemagne's entourage. The king himself sat in the front row with Abbot Engelbert at his side as Leo read from the scriptures. The pope pronounced a final blessing. Charlemagne rose slowly from his seat and kneeled before the altar, the train of his fur-edged cloak spreading out behind him in a circle of blue velvet. The light of many candles cast a golden glow on his graying curls. The congregation hushed with curiosity. They did not recognize this part of the Christmas liturgy. One by one, a dozen of the bishops came forward and spread out across the front of the church at the king's left. A row of Frankish knights in chain mail took their places at his right. The Pope's voice rang out from the chancel. "If the Emperor of the East won't rule his people, then you, great Charles of the Franks, will be the leader of the West." Leo stepped forward, cradling in his hands a glittering crown, and placed it on Charlemagne's head. "On this Christmas Day, I declare you Emperor," he cried. The cathedral broke out in excited cries. "Life and victory to Charles!" The king rose to his full height and turned toward the people, arms outstretched. "I will serve and protect you with all of my might." "The great peace-bringing emperor has been crowned by God," Leo exclaimed. The people cheered and stamped their feet as a smiling Charles marched down the aisle, followed by Leo, the knights, and the bishops. As they fell into their places in the procession, John leaned over and shouted into Engelbert's ear, "This is the dawn of a new era." "You mean the new borders of the empire?" "I mean the power of the church in political affairs. The Pope has just declared an emperor." Engelbert grinned and raised an eyebrow. "Ah, But 2 days ago, the new emperor declared the Pope. So which is the true seat of power? The cheering people surged behind him, and they were pushed out into the street in front of St. Peter's, where the celebrations had already begun. Within a few weeks, Charlemagne's knights rounded up Paschal and his co-conspirators. They were tried and found guilty of treason. Charles sentenced them to death, but relented at Leo's request. In Constantinople, in 802, the Eastern Empress Irene was overthrown in an uprising led by her treasurer. With the aid of men like Alcuin, Charlemagne emphasized education and religious reform. His reign became known as the Carolingian Renaissance. He died on January 2nd, 814, and left the empire to his son, Louis the Pious. Leo survived a second revolt after Charlemagne's death and maintained his position as pope until he died in 816.